like to thank the Biblioteca Gymnasium, which made available this room in which we are having our discussion, and the Fondazione Gramsci Emilia-Romagna, which is co-organizer of this critical dialogue and sponsor your cocktail. And I have also to say something they asked me to tell you, that downstairs in the court there is a concert. So if you leave this room, please don't go downstairs shouting or talking loud or something like this, because they wouldn't have the seat. And now let me introduce Walter Mignolo. Walter has begun to work with the Samsung this morning, that is here, so we have to thank him particularly for this. And he is available to discuss some aspects of his work with us. Walter Mignolo is worldwide well known, so I don't have to introduce them. I would only recall some of his most important books, like The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Local History, Global Design, The Idea of Latin American. He is professor at Duke University, and now he is professor here for a week at our University of the Samsung. We have asked Walter to discuss some aspect of his work. And his work revolved around the idea of the centering of the view of modernity. And the most important critical tool is coloniality. Coloniality is not colonialism, but it's an epistemic device, as well as an exercise of truth and of exercise of power. And coloniality encompasses different domains: the economic, with the exploitation of labor and resources; the political, with authority and control; the civic, with gender and sexuality control; and the epistemic, with control of knowledge and subjectivity. The first question I would ask you concerns your relationship and similarity and difference with the work like that of Edward Said, or broader speaking of postcolonialism. Because on one side we can surely see some similar features, but on the other side I also think that there are some fundamental differences. The colonial, the critical approach of Walter as border thinking can only come from the margin of European influence, because it has to recognize the historical roots of the infrastructure, of epistemic infrastructure of inequality. I think this is far from the intentions of Said's Orientalism, which was merely intended to deconstruct the ideological self-representation of the West through the lens of the negative colonial side. The colonial implied subaltern resistance. You don't use very often the term subaltern, I would like to ask you that. And in this sense, it's probably more close to Said's cultural imperialism than Said's Orientalism, in which cultural imperialism there are not only the hegemonic representation from the West, but also the counter culture coming and the resistance coming from peripheries. And under this respect, I think your work could be more close to that of subaltern studies, although there are also in this case, I think, some differences, because, for instance, for Ramajit Bua, subaltern is a political class. is a tool in order to represent a topological relationship of power, but it has not too much to do with racism, for instance, or not necessarily. And then the other point has to do with your historical interpretation of modernity. Because for Said and for the post-colonial studies, the 18th century and the Enlightenment was the important century in which Europe was able to universalize, impose itself as a universal pattern to refer to. Hegel's philosophy of history was probably the main expression of these processes. So this was the first point, your position within this broader field of the post-colonial critique. The second point has to do with space and how to map the globe and how the maps of the globe developed and originated. Modern space, according to your critical approach, is embodied within the colonial project of European domination of the world. So therefore, America was not discovered but invented, according to and it was a Renaissance invention, not an invention of the Enlightenment. Later on, Latin America was an Enlightenment invention in order to differentiate this American space and subordinate southern part of America to the Anglo-Saxon North American and US after the Revolution. But how to deal with the internal fracture of Europe? In the 18th century, there was also the invention of Southern Europe, for instance, and also of Eastern Europe. Also, the concept of Eastern Europe developed in the 18th century. But let me quote briefly a Jesuit of the 16th century, Michele Navarro. Michele Navarro was a Jesuit who worked, his mission was in Calabria, in southern Italy. And he wrote to his Jesuit brothers in Latin America, porque tengo para mí que él que probaré bien en estas Indias de por acá será apto parlaste allá. So this was in the 16th century as an interesting production of the otherness which crossed the Atlantic and which assumed a social and cultural fracture which was not strictly related to a topographical reference but was scattered throughout the Atlantic. So the idea was our Indies, then this expression became, is an interesting metaphor which unifies space rather than divides. So faced with this fracture which crossed the very European space, how can we connect the spaces throughout the world? How can we design geography of coloniality as well as the colonial geography? So it seems to me that fractures which cross the global spaces in the very beginning design mobile borders which challenge any topographical representation of power, such as Europe opposed to America. And so I would like to listen to comment on this point. And this brings me to the consideration of the relationship between local knowledge and global, international, universal. You can use different words. Some years ago, you wrote a very interesting chapter on Gramsci and Marianne. And I fully agree with you in excluding any reciprocal direct influence. Some authors consider that since Mariatti was here in Italy at the beginning of the 20s, he was influenced by Gramsci and so on, but I think your argument are persuading that there was no influence on both sides. And I also agree that the importance is precisely that they produce a local knowledge. Gramsci, the Southern question, Mariatti is Peru of indigenous people and so on. Moreover, I would say that the most important similarity lies in the fact that they identify culture and cultural critique as a crucial aspect of political strategy. In other terms, Gramsci was not an original thinker in the 20s because he dealt with the peasant question, because it wasn't uncommon actually by the middle of the 20s at least, within international communism to deal with, in a constructive way, with peasants, because the period was of the new political economy, so this was the phase of the revolution. But the most important point is that he understood that the rationalization of the social question in southern Italy was the main hindrance to develop a revolutionary process in Italy. He was aware that the alliance between northern working class and southern peasants depended not only from an economic common interest, not from a political strategy of a centralized party, but required to overcome a racial fracture that the positivistic socialism at the turn of the century had created. But for both these authors, I think, although they have some differences, but they have also similarities, they had two, I would say, main common concerns. One is precisely related to concern local knowledge. Local knowledge was crucial because it allowed to recognize the multiplicities of the sources of exploitation, and enable the mobilization of practice of resistance which involve all these different aspects. In this sense, local knowledge is necessary in order to overcome an abstract universalistic paradigm of exploitation. But for both was important also the international level in the terms of the translation of local knowledge in a broader international context. In the constant way they lived under the historical circumstances in which they lived, this was international socialism. I was always struck by Mariatti because in the late 20s, although he was fully aware to be an heterodox Marxist, completely, but he tried to hide to the people of the First International these aspects, just in order to be part of this international alliance. So, and it was also, and you remind that those articles, as he was here in Europe, he wrote a lot on Asia, the Baku conference, so he has really an international vision of this transformation. So, the question which followed is comments on Gramsci and Mariatti is precisely how is it possible to combine the idea of local knowledge and the ambition to connect this global knowledge in a broader international context through a translation of practice, actually, not on the basis of a universal abstract paradigm. and how to combine this local knowledge and connection, international connection, with an idea of a colonial matrix, as you call it, a colonial matrix which seems to be monolithic actually, and on which a series of devices of control operate, controlling economy, authority, genders, and so on. My colleague, Davide.
How would you prefer? You prefer to address his question before or the Yeah. There are lots of questions. You tell that.
Would you like to go together if you don't have
whatever you decide. But because there is a lot of issues here. So go ahead. So thank you for being here. I'm glad to be in Bologna, so thank you for the invitation to all the kind of the team of the summer school. This is my third visit in Bologna. The first visit was when I was in Paris with my PhD or doctorat de troisième cycle, they said. And I have to confess now that I almost came to Bologna as a kind of naive young guy in Argentina, and we were reading all the kind of the French, and we were reading all the Italian, Benedetto Croce, Armando della Morte, Dante, Gramsci, of course. We were getting Montaigne, Feltrinelli books. I mean, there was so in that context, I wrote a letter to Roland Barthes and another letter to Umberto Eco. That would like to study. The Eco at the time was that the Interessat was Apocalipti Integrati, and Barthes was already several things, but the analysis really was serious. So both responded. Eco responded in a page and a half, out of the 4 lines, but well, I said, Paris or Bologna, I go to Paris. So my apology, now I will come to Bologna rather to Paris. Well, thank you very much in first place for such a rich reflection and taking my work seriously. So I will be brief because there is another package of issues coming. So I will be very brief, and I will say for those of you that participate in the seminar will listen to this or hear to this for the second time. But just to get the fundamental, that coloniality is a decolonial concept. So we write modernity/coloniality, but modernity is not a decolonial concept, of course, it's a modern concept. But modernity coloniality is a decolonial concept, right? That's the first point. The second point is that version, that articulation of modernity coloniality and decoloniality emerged not in France or Germany or United States, emerged in the South American Andes. So it's not a European concept. That's what I'm trying to. And that is the moment when people outside of Europe began to realize that European history and intellectual history assume and make people believe that non-European cannot think. There is a recent book by Hamid Tabashi, the Iranian intellectual, called Can Non-European Think? And I wrote the preface to that book, addressing that kind of vexing question, and other people did it before. So that is the first kind of clarification that I would like to make when we will talk about biopolitics. Is a European concept, of course, and why biopolitics emerged? Well, because there were issues, there were problems that were relevant for Europeans, and so biopolitics took over. So coloniality was something that was relevant not for Europe. It was very difficult for Europeans to see coloniality because they generated coloniality. So kind of began to perceive coloniality was the people at the end of the spectrum, right? At the end of the kind of the European expansion. And the European expansion was not just, as Fanon reminds us, it's not just military, political, economic. It's the perversity of epistemological expansion that kind of distort, steal the memories, silence the memories, etc. So coloniality is a response to that. It's an affirmation also. Say, what? You don't fool us anymore. We don't buy that. I mean that only European thing. And I know that because when I went to France and when I came to Bologna, was because these are the people who think. So I want to learn to think. So that is a kind of a shift. I would say that more than the margin is a shift in the geography of reasoning. And now what we are seeing is that the centers are beginning to emerge in what was before the margin of Europe. So, and that's the kind of the multiplicity of local histories. So that is one, and that is one kind of border thinking emerged. Border thinking means border dwelling. You dwell in the border when you have a memory that is not the memory of Europe, but then the memory of Europe comes to you, and you have no choice because you are kind of educated in the school and the university, etc. But you have a different memories, so Europe doesn't have the memory of belonging to society colonized in a different way. Peru is different to Argentina, etc. I have to say also that I am equal Argentinian, pure blood. All my grandparents belong to the immigration of the 19th century. But you feel it. I mean, they were almost European, right? So, and being in Argentina, you know that you are almost European, that there were other people, that kind of the elite that were there in the 18th century, they kind of appropriated all the land, they governed they control the country, they control the location, they control everything. So you began to feel all that kind of discomfort. You began to feel that there is something to which you don't belong, but at the same time you know. So border thinking emerged from the awareness of dwelling in the border. That's it. So that is the first set of issues. The second issue is Said, right? Well, for me, there are two Said. One is the Said post-colonial, that was made post-colonial after the publication of Orientalists, because post-colonial, the conversation of post-colonial is after the concept of postmodernity emerged, 78, Lyotard, the postmodern condition. So the post-colonial piggyback on postmodernity, right? And then you see the trilogy of Baba, Said, Spivak, Said Foucault, Spivak Derrida, Baba, Lacan. And then you have the Sumatran branch. So that is the genealogy, as you said. I mean, all these people somehow come in the kind of the genealogy of the 18th century, related more to the French and British imperialism. So we come from another genealogy of thought, the kind of the colonization of the Americas by Spanish and Portuguese. In the 16th century, there was no French or British in sight. There were some travelers, there were a lot of pirates in the Atlantic. The pirates were trying to steal the gold of the Spanish galleon, but it was Spain and Portugal that kind of control. And that is so our genealogy of thought is related to the Renaissance, not to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment would not have happened without the Renaissance. That's a long story, but allow me to just make that statement. So that's one point. The other point, the Said I feel very close to, is the side of the question of Palestine. That is the side that is decolonial, to just kind of relate to fanno, relate to what they call I don't remember the name of the Algerian and the Tunisian French who wrote The Colonizer and the Colonized. So the question of Palestine belongs to that kind of essay that are not academic, because postcoloniality is in a way quite academic. At the same time, the big contribution of coloniality is to have introduced the colonial question into post-structuralism, the debate in Europe and United States. So, when people ask me, and I don't have much time to elaborate the distinction, I say, well, you know, it's like Protestant and Catholic. Protestant and Catholic are both Christian, but you don't confuse one with another, right? They're specific issue. So the post-colonial and decolonial is more or less like that. I don't want to say who is Protestant and who is Catholic, that's not the point. The point is that we have in common colonialism. How we deal with that, how we think of that, that is. So our genealogy of thought, our decolonial, is not coming from post-structuralism, but is coming from dependency theory and theology of liberation in Latin America. That's one thing. And the other, that a little bit blurred at the beginning, but then becoming more and more clear, is the Bandung Conference of 1955. Much before, if you want to put it in chronological term, that the kind of the version of post-coloniality. Or the post-colonial. On the other hand, the term post-colonial for us, doesn't in South America, doesn't mean anything. Because what is post-colonial for the post-colonial is basically the post-colonial during the Cold War and after the Cold War. The post-colonial independence of in South America was in the 16th century. I mean in the 19th century. But the way that this has been theorized in South America was the end of colonialism is the beginning of internal colonialism. And internal colonialism is when the native, in this case, Creole Mestizo, kicked the Spanish and the Portuguese home, and they do exactly what the Portuguese doing. So indigenous people were much worse under the Republic than under the colonies, right? So the post-colonial in Latin America, there's kind of a small group, etc., but they have no really import in public sphere, in public debate at the university, etc., etc. So that is the question of Said, but I mean, I would like to add here in the question that is not Europe opposed to America, going to the third point and just mention my ethic. They are entangled. Number one, there is no America without Europe. Before Europe, there was Tawantinsuyu, there was Anahuac, there was Aviajana, there was Turtle Island, and all this kind of that you know, the territorial naming. So, come the European, and since the European were Christian, and Christian imagined the world in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and that was the TO map. So, okay, let's add a fourth world, America. So, Europe constituted itself as Europe, because I mean, it was not Europe yet, it was with a bunch of Western Christians that were desperate to kind of expand Christianity after they lost Jerusalem in the Crusade. And there is a lot of arguments in the 15th century. There is a meeting, even in Milan, of what the Christians shall do in order to regain the position they lost when they lost it. So at that moment, Columbus makes a big mistake, but at the same time, land in unknown land. So Christianity takes over. So there is no opposition There is no America without Europe. And there is no Europe as we know it today without America, because that was the first moment of the construction of the modern colonial world. The world we are living in today, the foundational moment is the 16th century, the Atlantic. Is Africa, is the America, what became the America, and Western Europe. Because that was it was, Western Atlantic Europe. So that is, now I think that there are several issues here. I will try to be use 2 or 3 minutes, so we have time to kind of go to another set of issues. So there are 2 issues here, the global. Why I brought local history is global design, and what is the point? What is the argument of that book? It's a very important one for me and for the elites, for me, kind of articulate my belief, but also for debates, current debates. There are only local history, cannot be global history. Right? Why? Why is that? Because global history has to be written from some local place. Right? Only God can write global history. Because He's all over. He's like the sphere in Pascal. And what that doesn't matter. So there are only local histories. Point 1. Point 2, there are some local history that are in a position to imagine and enact global design. And there is a lot of local history that have to live with that. Right? So that is the question. So how do you connect so the colonial nature of power is not a fix. It is very complex, mobile structure that I analyzed it in a different place. It comes into emergence in the 16th century, in the hands of the Spanish, and then comes the Dutch, and then comes the British, and then transformed, etc., etc. But it's a complex structure composed of domain, levels, and flows. But that is very long to explain. What I just want to say is that for us the question, the history that we write is the history of the colonial nature of power. We don't write the history of America, we don't write the radical, we are analyzing and trace the history of the colonial nature of power. And the colonial nature of power was, for 5 centuries, let's say 1500 to 2000, created, managed, manipulated by European imperialism. And then comes the United States, so the kind of the North Atlantic. What happened today, and we are in a mess, the world is in a mess, is because the West, and the West is a very complex structure, right? But the United States will most likely be closer to Europe than to China and Russia or Iran. I don't think the United States will negotiate with its people. For the first time in 500 years, after 2000, the West can no longer control the colonial nature of power. So, the monster they created is escaping their control. And who is disputing it? Russia, China, the BRICS. Now the BRICS are in a kind of it is a critical moment because the United States obviously don't like to have the BRICS there, but Russia and China are there, and now Iran is growing. So far from being a fixed structure, it's like saying that the unconscious is a fixed structure, or like saying that the plus value is a fixed structure. No, that changes, right? But that is so that is the question of the global design. And that there is another thing that I would like to, but no, I will leave it. I will leave it. This because we go too long, and just want to say that part of the mess that we are in today from our perspective is understandable and explainable through the history of the colonial metropolitan. And we can go into specific. The debt, the kind of exploitation of labor, financialization, the currency war, the military war in China, etc., etc., etc. We can go into kind of detail in relation to the colonial metropolitan. But Mariatti and Gramsci, and I think Roberto Reinotto, we taught a seminar on Mariatti and Gramsci many years ago, and I think I recognized that in the article that we got, and if I didn't, Roberto, I apologize for not recognizing, but I think I did. So what is interesting about Mariatti and Gramsci, so I was responding not so much to Gramsci and Mariatti, but the intent of the post-colonial now, because I was asked to write an article on post-colonial Gramsci. And they wanted to know the influence of Gramsci in Latin America. So this is, and I said, well, no, I will write Mariatti and Gramsci because if you do that, you continue to produce the kind of coloniality of knowledge from the left. Because coloniality is from the right, the left, and the center. So I wrote an article, not Gramsci and Mariatti, but Mariatti and Gramsci. They were more or less the same age. I think Gramsci was about 3 or 4 or 5 years old. So the point was to show how two Marxists, one in Italy and the other in the Andes, they were kind of delinking from the orthodoxy of Marxism and really thinking what was going on. So Marxism was a starting point, but the southern question was another, but the southern question is linked to the history of the fabrication of the South in the 18th century, at the same time that is fabrication of Orientalism. So that is kind of the moment of affirmation of the control of knowledge of Europe. So you know Gramsci much better than I want to tell you more about, a little bit more about Mariatti. Mariatti was dissident in the sense that he was looking that the problem in Peru and Latin America was the problem of land. To deal with the problem of indigenous people was not a cultural issue, but the question was the expropriation of land. And the second problem he brings to the fore is racism. And then from there comes Quijano, from Mariatti. So he was kind of expelled from the Communist Party because he said, how can you be Marxist and talk about land and racism? Right? This is totally out of the kind of the Marxist analysis. So that so Quijano take on that, on the concept of racism and the concept of land that already because Quijano comes also from Marxism, but little by little he began to distance himself for reasons very similar to Mariatti. That from Marxism he couldn't confront the question of knowledge, not just the culture, but the question of knowledge and the question of racism. Yeah? So in the last analysis, the question here is very important local history. How the Europe that has been displaced from the center of Europe. I mean, the heart of Europe for Hegel, remember, was France, England, and Germany. And then you have the south of Europe, and then you have the Eastern Europe, that they call the northeast of Europe, and he includes Russia, and the heart of Europe. So that is the three Europe. But by the time of Hegel, the south of Europe has been already established. So the question is the colonial Mexico's power that produced that? It's not a question to include this into the colonial Mexico power. It's the colonial Mexico power that generated that kind of difference and the responses to that difference. So the question again is not included for us, and the colonial Mexico power is kind of the mechanism that established a global world order, and how to establish it through knowledge. right? Because they don't go there and mark with painting. This line corresponds to such and such and such. So what is interesting for me to conclude here, the first one, is that Mariátegui and Gramsci responded from two places that have been displaced from Europe. One in Europe itself, and the other in the Andes. However, Gramsci is better known than Mariátegui, and that's part of the coloniality of knowledge, right? Since Mariátegui is Peruvian, he wrote in Spanish, well, he just Italian, no, Italian is the language of the Renaissance. It's one of the 6 major imperial colonial languages. Not because Italy had a lot of colonies, but history had a kind of cultural capital with the Renaissance.
Okay, good evening. Okay, I will in some way change topics, but in another way we'll be going back to some of the topics that you already commented. And since I think that one of the main solicitations coming from Mignolo's work, also expressed by the title of this critical dialogue, Border Gnosis, is the need to make explicit the spatial and epistemological location of knowledge production, I want to make clear that my reading of his work has been done from the perspective of an archaeologist, anthropologist, something in between, interested in pre-colonial and early colonial indigenous American society. So I'm looking from that moment. And so, obviously, from this point of view, Mignolo's main contribution, in my opinion, especially in the darker side of the Renaissance, has been the inclusion of Renaissance and, let's use early modern colonial America within the long genealogy of modernity and its darker side, coloniality, with its production of colonial difference. So this chronological and spatial displacement going toward margin that is both geographical but also chronological toward the origin of modernity and coloniality allows, in fact, identifying the origins and development of different phenomena, such as the subalternization of local knowledge, one of the main topics of the book, which were usually studied from the 18th century onward and mainly in Asia and Africa. So somewhere he brought to the fore Renaissance, 16th century, and America, and that's why I was interested in that when I first read it. And what I want to stress here is that building a genealogy allows you to understand, to grasp some form of continuities in this coloniality, but every genealogy is also marked by fractures, discontinuities. And so I want to, let's say, play on this topic, asking in which measure the production of difference in early modern times explains some later phenomena. And I want just to bring to the fore a specific topic that you mentioned before and we have talked about in our course in these days, that is, for example, racism. It also has been the topic of the last critical dialogue with Civiltà, Paolo and Sandro Mezzadri, that also spoke about racism. So my question is that if on one side, as you argue, it is undeniable that early modern coloniality, and especially the hierarchization of religions through the ideology of the purity of blood, in some way established the epistemic framework for the birth of for that process of naturalization, biologization of difference that led to racism. On the other hand, and that's my question, do you think that there were other forms of coloniality, other tools of coloniality at work in the 16th century that in some way can explain other later aspects, and especially what I'm interested in, and that's why it was this question, can explain production of difference today. The idea is that looking for that margin, you don't only see the 16th century, you also see, in some way, our time. And just to make an example, I'm thinking, for example, to the specific facet of the so-called denial of coevalness, that is in Johannes Fabian terms, the pushing of indigenous others in a typological past, or the early modern invention of a universal notion of Christian humankind, that in his terms is the transformation of the local knowledge, invention of Christian humankind in a global design. The whole humankind must be transformed in Christian humankind. I think that an historical analysis of the usage of categories such as Indio, for example, revealed that far from referring to static, fixed essences, they really refer to a process of inscription of diversity, diversity of people within a general category that transformed them in subaltern subjects of the main religious, political, and ethical order. Especially interesting to me is the fact that the description of Indians as pagans not only equated them with past enemies of Christianity, so that's a lottery, that's politics, pushing them in the past, but also imposes on them a will of transformation through civilization. Thus laying the base for all the different and inherently violent transforming wheels of modernity, Christianization in the 16th century, the civilizing mission in the 19th century, developmental ideology in the 20th century, the exportation of democracy in the 21st. So, inclusive practices can be as violent as dividing practices in some way. So my question is, looking at the 16th century America, give us a more complex view of what we could call the toolbox of coloniality. Which other tools besides races did it contain? And can these other tools shed light on contemporary forms of deferred action and civilization? Then my second and last point, it's even more related with my own epistemic location, with my disciplinary territory. I'm not really fond of disciplinary limits, border, actually I don't even know who, but since I work in archaeology and anthropology, I cannot escape this problem. Because archaeology and anthropology are among the disciplines most compromised with coloniality, with the production of colonial difference. So this undeniable epistemic location raises uneasy questions about our possibility of looking for the margins. That is, of moving our epistemic location to those margins from where, according to Walter's work, decolonialism becomes possible. If not, if it is not possible for me, for us, are we doomed to analyze and reveal the colonial dimension of our own discourses, to make a Eurocentric criticism of Eurocentrism in some way, to use your words? Let me make just a specific example on the topic that I'm really interested in. In the darker side of Renaissance, he analyzed one of the most wonderful books ever produced in the 16th century, that is Bernardino de Sahagún, called Florentinos. For those who are not familiar with it, it's kind of early product of ethnography. This Franciscan friar worked decades collecting indigenous knowledge, recording indigenous knowledge, and we can say refining indigenous knowledge by putting it into a clearly Western framework that is the encyclopedia. So basically he wrote an encyclopedia on Aztec, or on the Aztec wall. All written in Nahuatl, all translated in the Aztec language, translated in Spanish, and illustrated with some drawings that are something in between native cryptography and European illustration. So it's a very complex text. And in the darker side of the Renaissance, you perfectly show how the structure of the work is in some way inspired by the encyclopedic works of Bartolomeo and others. No? So how this indigenous knowledge is in some way put into a cage that orders it. So in some way colonizing native literacy. So my question is, in texts like the Sagun one, and there are many other possible examples, do you think that historical anthropology, or if you prefer the old jargon, ethnohistory, let's say the traditional tools that we use to look at those texts, are still capable to grasp the inner fissures, I would say the inner borders of such complex texts in order not to make them objects of study, but places from where to look, to hear. I don't want to be too romantic here to say to hear the native voice, but to grasp some kind of native knowledge that has not been completely erased by the colonization of literacy. And still capable to reveal alternative, non-Western system of knowledge? Could the complex and conflicting articulation between those systems and the Western colonial framework of the specific genre of the encyclopedia disclose the way toward a really pluritopic hermeneutic, in your words? Could the cracks and fissures within such colonial texts be the alternative loci of enunciation from where border gnosis can be enacted, even from a Western standpoint? Or is such a name only reachable by non-Western thinkers speaking from borders of Western epistemology? Please don't tell me that I must go there. I cannot do anything. That's all.
That's all. Well, thank you again. Thank you to both of you to organize this and to take my work so seriously. So please stay.
That's very kind.
No, but I mean, that, seriously, this is an indication that something is changing. I mean, 30 years ago, there were not too many European intellectuals that would take seriously non-European intellectuals. Right? So something is happening. I'm not the only one who is receiving attention. United States and Europe that engaging seriously with our work, many. So thank you. So to answer your two points, address your two points, I will connect with the last one, the Gramsci Mariátegui, and the question that, so we have introduced the concept of pluriversality. And we were discussing this morning the question of totality in the seminar. So every cosmology, including Western cosmology, including secular, the secularization of Western epistemology, the Western cosmology that basically Christian, have the right, just aspire to the totality and have the right to aspire to the totality. What is an aberration is to pretend that is the only totality. And that is what is happening today. And that Kikano addressed in the foundational article of this. So when we go into the multiplicity of totalities, we eliminate universalities. We are not talking about new universals, we are talking about pluriversality. Not universality, but pluriversality. Some prefer no universal, and I want fight with people who prefer not universal. We use pluriversality because we have a whole argument on how pluriversality comes into the picture. So, the first of your 2 points, racism and what else is there that kind of across the centuries, I would mention. First of all, that racism doesn't have anything to do with blood, doesn't have anything to do with, there is no race. Human beings have different complexion according to the regeneration of different parts of the globe. But race is an invention to classify people. Race is already a racist concept. So racism is an epistemological issue, it's not an ontological issue. So that is a kind of one of the foundational moments in what we call the colonial difference. And the colonial difference, that is a question of knowledge, is invented, is a fiction, means that whoever controls knowledge have the possibility of making other people ontological and epistemological inferior. Not just different. Because in every difference in the colonial nature of power goes the power differential and the hierarchy. So ontological difference is because these people are different from us, and so they cannot really reason. And because they cannot really reason, they are ontologically different. So the epistemological and ontological difference plays the foundational moment of racism as we know it today. That doesn't mean there was no differences in other civilizations, the Incas or the Aztecs, the Chinese, etc., but not this. Why? Because racism, as emerged in the 16th century, is attached to labor, to the exploitation of labor, and to the exploitation of land. If you make Indians inferior, and Victoria said, well, they are endowed of use, game just like the Spaniard, but then how you justify the expropriation of land? What do you make them inferior? They are like women or children. And then the question of sexism appeared connected to racism. So racism is related to exploitation of land, and also related to exploitation of labor. Slavery is transforming human being into slave. Africans were not slaves. They had been enslaved. They were human beings. But so they made inferior, and so racism goes from the 16th century to today, and we can articulate the different moments in the colonial nature of power where the content of the conversation changes. Robino and the Darwin and all this kind of thing, and the national racism and the religion, the articulation of the religious racism, etc. So that is why the colonial nature of power for us is very important, because it allows us to follow. So that is one, racism. The second is the colonial difference, ontological and epistemical. The third is international law. There is no international law until the 16th century. There is divine law, there is natural law, there is human law, but international law emerged in the 16th century precisely, and that Carl Schmitt saw it very well. The global linear thinking is related to the use European, as Smith said, is Eurocentric, and he doesn't say Eurocentrism as a kind of critique. That's the way it was. It's a descriptive term for Smith. International law is Eurocentric. So, and there is also, next to the colonial difference, the imperial difference that crosses 5 centuries to today. The moment of the invention of the fiction of imperial difference is the Ottoman Sultanate. So the Spaniards saw that Suleiman the Magnificent was a magnificent guy. Was as important as Charles V. But they had to make them inferior because they had the wrong guy. So the imperial difference appears at the moment that you cannot colonize someone, but you control knowledge and you have the power to devalue them. So we can go through the centuries, and now we get to China and Russia. That is imperial difference. The West never colonized Russia, never colonized China, but read the press and read the books and read all the kind of the defense, and then you will see that the colonial difference, the imperial difference continues. So there are many issues, but then we can say also that the 16th century is the foundation of what liberal Marxists call capitalism. So liberal like capitalism, Marxists don't like capitalism, but they agree that there is something called capitalism. So we talk about the coloniality of the economy, is related to racism, is related to international law, is related to the colonial and imperial difference. So it's not just a structure of capitalism, but it's a colonial of power. And that kind of comes until today. So, shall be brief for the second point. The second point is very difficult to deal with. But, well, at this moment I think that there are two ways of looking at the example you gave this example. There is the problem you raise for disciplinary knowledge, that ethnohistory, archaeology, etc. And so, disciplinary knowledge is part of coloniality knowledge. What are the disciplines? The disciplines are there to discipline you. So we always say that decoloniality, decolonial thinking is not interdisciplinary, it's not transdisciplinary, it's undisciplinary. When I wrote the Dark Renaissance, I'm not a Renaissance scholar. I was trained in philosophy and literature in Bologna, and then I was trained as a teacher in Paris. But when I began to realize what happened in the kind of Renaissance, I get very angry. So the Dark Renaissance is a book written out of anger. But I had to play poker, as I said. I could not write the manifesto. I had to play poker and write the book following the rule, not of a discipline in particular, because I talk about languages, I talk about memory, and I talk about cartography. But I follow the rule of argumentation, the research of argumentation, in such a way that the book received a long review of Anthony Grafton, who is one of the 2 or 3 Renaissance scholars in the United States, a long review in the New York Review of Books. And I am not saying that to say, oh, how great I am. I am saying that he had to pay attention to. And that was the point. If I write a pamphlet, could be dismissed, and he said it. A lot of pamphlets have been written about 92, but this book we have to pay attention, and he has his criticisms, etc., etc., etc. So, what I was going to say is, it's not a disciplinary book because I'm not a Renaissance scholar. It's an undisciplinary book that follows, so it's a epistemic disobedient book. That at the same that disobeyed the discipline, intervened in a field I was not trained. I just was trained as a scholar, as a sympathician, so I knew how to do research, I knew how to build argument. And the book was written from as much as I could from the perspective of the now people. Because there was a lot of history written by the Spaniard, but what happened if we try to see Sahagún from the perspective of the Tramatini? Right? So, and that is already worth of thinking, because you engage, it's not just that you report, you have to put yourself as much as you can. How this guy could have been thinking when they were saying what they were saying to the missionary. So all of that to say that on the one hand, one of the problems, what do we do, what do people do, historian or then historian, to get out of getting Sahagún as an object of study? And the other is how we use Sahagún as people of European descent in the Americas, I mean, colonizing, entangled with that dimension of, and how indigenous people now began to live there. Because what is very important now, indigenous people are taking up that moment of the 16th century, but at the same time they are trying to rebuild the knowledge that books like Sahagún destroyed. So that, I think, is the most important. So the question is, who is reading, in this case, who is reading Sahagún? From what perspective? Why? What for? So the decolonial approach is always asking for the enunciation. the modern epistemology is always asking for the enunciate. How many pages has been written about Heidegger or about Marx? 1,000. Who is asking why Heidegger was interested in being and time and not being in space? Being on the one hand, time on the other. So why Marx was interested in that moment that they invented a kind of primitive accumulation, because for him capitalism could not be understood if not understood in relation to the Industrial Revolution, where we say, well, listen, there is no Industrial Revolution without the Atlantic, without the 16th century. So the question is always asking who is saying what, where, why. And so that begins the kind of the decolonial reading, even for enunciation or open enunciation, that's not necessarily decolonial. But just to conclude here, the question is precisely the universality. If there are many perspectives to read text like this, and we have to kind of reduce the discipline to their size, and not to start believing that the only valuable knowledge is disciplinary knowledge. Disciplinary knowledge in general is part of the reproduction of coloniality. So that is another issue to discuss, but I mean, we don't have much time and I stop. Thank you.
Okay, while we look for a mic, let's open the first round of questions. Does anybody want to enter? Okay. There's the mic is coming.
Okay, this is you're going to find this funny because it's actually a question for you, Professor Capuzzo. Well, also, it's open for all of you to
It's good basic dialogue, so everybody should be interpolated.
Well, you mentioned the possibility of the production of localized knowledge placed with samples of production and variety state. And to me this is related to the heterodoxical readings from inside of Marxist tradition. This is a process that has been going on at least from the times of the Second International, if not before. And I think that what is at stake is the possibility of a wider range of interpretations that reflect on a new set of categories from particular localized perspectives. We have seen this kind of appropriations from the margin, because the subject of the discussion is coloniality from the margin, and in the anti-colonial struggles for liberation in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even here in Europe. Yet the translation of universal concepts, such as those in Marxist theory, is problematic, and we have to accept that. Especially because it's been seen like a form of Eurocentric thinking. So the question would be, is it possible to think Marxism in our times beyond the European tradition of critique, and which are the conditions to do this in our contemporary times?
I would collect some questions.
Yes, my question is for Professor Mignolo about when you were mentioning the fact that Europe and the United States or America are the same thing, and you mentioned the Atlantic as the space that connected, where this connection happened, in fact, by Columbus going over the Atlantic. I was thinking, what do you think about the Mediterranean then? Do you perceive it as a border? Do you perceive it as nothing, or do you perceive it as a space that we can actually look at? Many authors have been now looking at the Mediterranean as a space where something happens or someone dies, or something happens in general. So I was wondering, what do you think about the Mediterranean space?
Hi, Professor Mignolo, and also to Professor Domenici. This was a question that I meant to ask during the seminar, and it just came to me again. But it's on the question of pluriversality. And I was wondering if you could give some comments comparing perhaps pluriversality with the concept that Aimé Césaire develops of a universality that is simply a collection of particularities, rather than a sort of localized totalities that are meaningful perhaps to the sort of contingencies on the ground among communities. So I'm just wondering what you think about juxtaposing those two ideas with each other, and what perhaps Césaire can offer the concept of pluriversality, and vice versa, what pluriversality can do to speak to Césaire's conception of a collection of particularities.
Let's stop for a moment. We will answer these two questions.
Well, I'm sorry, I could understand them very well, but from there, my ears are not very good, and the kind of the microphone just makes all the voice for me. So I need a translator. So I understand that the first, the second question was if the notion of pluriversality could be understood as a collective, as a universal, as a collection of particulars, something like that.
Compared with the ideas of universality as a collection of particularities? Was it the question?
That was a theory by Aimé Césaire.
By Césaire.
So perhaps, why do you need to say the notion of universal? That's the main point. For me, if you feel comfortable saying that the new universal is a collection of particular, that I think you can do it. But for me, what bothers me there is the desire to maintain universal, because the universal is a very Western concept. There's no other civilization that have a concept of universal. And as we know, comes from the medieval philosophy, and then kind of follows the tradition and become one of the foundations and the foundational belief of knowledge, of universal knowledge. And universal knowledge is a very powerful way of controlling people. So our intention is to get rid of the universal. Sometimes we talk about pluriversality, but again, pluriversality is dialogue. So pluriversality is not saying, no, you are wrong, we are right. See, in our theory, in our argumentation, pluriversality comes as a necessary concept, and that is also related because now what happened, and I didn't have time to explain that, but the contestation and the fact that the West is losing control of the colonial measure power generates two paths. One is a multipolar world order. And the multipolar world order is a state interstate system. So I think that the invasion of Iraq was the last moment in which perhaps Libya, but the last moment in which a kind of unilateral decision could have been taken, a monopolar world. And now, I mean, the report that just came in Britain kind of denounced very kind of critically the unthoughtful decision of Tony Blair. So the multipolar world is a capitalist world. It's a common economy, but a kind of political confrontation. And that is why China and Russia are kind of confronted with the United States and Europe, depending on what, but they don't know yet where to go. Go with the Chinese, go with the... So the pluriversality is the decolonial, and the multipolar world is the de-westernizing trajectory, in the sense that the westernization of the world stopped. So neoliberalism is not so much a way of a kind of economic exploitation, because that's capitalism or economical reality. Neoliberalism was the last attempt to homogenize the world. The first was the Christian, the second was civilizing vision, the third was development, and the fourth in that trajectory. So that is kind of, and the other is the Mediterranean. Well, yesterday we, no, 2 days ago we heard a lecture on the Indian Ocean. I don't know if you attended the... No, you did not. I mean, I am not criticizing you, I'm just asking. So because it's part of the response. So what happened in the 16th century, I mean, two things. The Mediterranean began to be displaced by the Atlantic. Clearly, right? The second thing is that the world map that we see today is a fabrication of Mercator or Helios and those magnificent. But when you see those maps, the Indian Ocean had disappeared. But before the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean was a tremendous center of traffic. The Mediterranean was practically in the margin. Because, I mean, what the Genovese, the Venetian, the Firenze, they were not looking west, they were looking south and east because there was the business, right? And Timbuktu and first Timbuktu, Baghdad, that is. So, and the Indian Ocean was part of the Silk Road and all this kind of thing. So there is a moment, I mean, Brodel analyzed the Mediterranean at the time of Philip III, that's a very important moment. But then the Atlantic began to take over, so that's part of my addressing your question. The second in the Mediterranean would be considered the border. Well, depends for whom. I mean, there is a wonderful novelette by Moroccan philosopher Khatibi, L'amour en deux langues. For Khatibi is a border. And L'amour en deux langues begins with the kind of two lovers who meet themselves in the middle of the Mediterranean. And so she is French and he is this Arab Muslim. And then they move to the north of Africa. But that's part of all the philosophical reflection of Khatibi that said, well, he introduced the double critique. This morning we were talking about double consciousness. The double critique is he, as an Arab Muslim philosopher, has a double task to critique Islamic fundamentalism and Western fundamentalism. So for him it is. But I don't know any case yet from a Western perspective. He has a very interesting debate with Derrida, when Derrida wrote Le Monde Humain de l'Autre. They know each other, they were friends. Derrida critiqued Khatibi, but I think that Derrida missed the point. And I think that he missed the point because apparently he blocked his kind of Algerian, no? You're Tunisian, Algerian, I mean, can we assume his Algerian memories, his Algerian skin? But the Rigan blocked it and kind of decided, like Rancière, to just embrace Western debates. So they blocked the possibility of border thinking. But Khatibi, no, Khatibi did it. And so he has a wonderful book also called Maghreb Pluriel. He has fantastic books about Arabic calligraphy. So he knew very well Western philosophy. And there is another, there is Al-Jabri, for example, another Moroccan philosopher that kind of deal, I mean, his thinking could be is very close to border thinking, because I said, what happened if Ibn Rushd was so rational? Then there is a space, a silence, and then Descartes take up on this kind of rational tradition of Muslim philosopher and Muslim thinker. So the Mediterranean is border thinking. Do you see it from the north of the Mediterranean?
Any other question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, because you were mentioning Paolo and in the seminar this morning, Gloria and Zaldua as two important thinkers for you in your own intellectual genealogy and thinking about coloniality and decolonial theory. I was also curious about the place of Enrique Dussel in your own thought and in coloniality, decolonial theory, and the theories such as transmodernity. Where would you situate that with respect to the project of decolonial theory? Is transmodernity in Dussel another way of thinking about decolonial theory? Is it part of that same project? And is Dussel trying to do something different than he did? I don't know.
Just a moment.
Very briefly and brief response. I was wondering if in the global south we are very compartmentalized by nation state. So if you are in Argentina, your horizon is only to study national literatures, Argentinian history, and so on. And when we move away from the national space, we embrace more Latin American identity or a broader perspective. But working in each of our countries, we are confined to just be an expert. On the question of area studies and global studies, that is also part of this summer school. So your experience with that, thank you.
Just one question.
You mentioned before the dependency theory debate, and dependency theory starting from Runzefranc and Wittgenstein and Wallerstein has developed like an heterodox Marxist analysis on capitalism. I was wondering if you think that is there any kind of like material dimension in this epistemic process you're describing? And just a curiosity, like how would you relate the fact of like a decolonial thinking with the actual fact of
teaching in a university in the US and like being totally part of the system.
Well, thank you very much for all the interesting question. Trying to be brief. So yes, I said this morning that for me, for those of you who were not in the classroom this morning, I said that when I came from Argentina to France to Europe to be a semiotician, I wanted to be a French or European semiotician like them. And then I realized that for several reasons was not possible. One of the reasons is education, because I mean, the people in the there were people from outside of Europe, and Roland Barthes and Jeanette and all this kind of process, and that the people I related with. But I didn't have a single French friend in the 3 years that I was in France. So my work at Ansaldúa was the wake-up call. Because when I read Ansaldúa, for those of you who didn't read Ansaldúa, Borderland La Frontera, she's a Chicana lesbiana. So she elaborated the concept of borderland, not just as a kind of geographical space. She said the borderland between Mexico and United States is a 20,000 miles border where the first world, the third world reads the first world and bleed. So this metaphor of bleeding, the first word that makes the third word bleed, that for me, and reading another part of the book, brought in a very powerful way what today we articulate that not the decolonial, but the colonial wound. So the colonial wound is what racist and sexist, in which are not physical. So that was a wake-up call. And the second, I realized that if I didn't feel comfortable in Argentina, I never felt that Argentina was my country. I got my document. It's because I was Italo-Argentinian. But up to that point, I didn't think about it. Right? So and then I worked Quijano, and Quijano opened it up for me, the kind of global vision. Now, how those two things relate to transmodernity? Transmodernity is a concept that introduced, there is other uses, but introduced by Dussel 2 years or 3 years later after Quijano, independent from Quijano. What Dussel understands by transmodernity? Two things. One is analytic. What we call modernity is not something that in Dussel world was just a kind of European making. Europe could not have made modernity without entanglement with the rest of the world. And that is one of the first questions. So that is a transmodern. He has a wonderful dialogue with Gianni Massimo about this issue, Dussel and Gianni Massimo. And the second meaning of transmodernity is to get rid of socialism. Because the future cannot be necessarily social, it has to be transmodern. It has to be transmodern, why? Because all these places that Europe colonized one day, and that was 93, will wake up and will respond. And they are responding in several ways. One of the ways is immigration and refugees. Other ways are not very desirable, like the ISIS, but that is a response of kind of what modernity generated. And the other is the drug cartel. We were saying the other day in the conference that the drug cartel, the first drug cartel was the British Empire and the Opium War, right? So these are the kind of transmodern responses that are not desirable, but modernity generated it. So that's more radical. Yeah, of course, the problem with the nation state, I mean, the nationalism, but I will get it from there. One of the problems with the nation state is two. There are two problems. One is one nation, one state. And that is why immigrant and refugee do not have place in a pretended homogeneous nation that belongs to one state. The second consequence of that is the nation state privileges the national over the humanity. And that again is the question of immigrant and refugee. And that is the justification of national security. In the report that just was published in England, judging the mistake of Tony Blair, they say, well, 150,000 minimum, what we know, civil Iraqis died in a war, in an invasion that had no other reason than national security. At the moment that the United States didn't have reason to keep giving money to the Pentagon because the Soviet Union was no longer a menace and they needed another. So that in general. But yes, in South America, the second point is, the question of nationality. That is the building of the one nation, one state. You have one nation, one state, one flag, one national literature, one national anthem. And now this is being contested from Ecuador, with other programs Ecuador and other programs Bolivia. The constitution of both countries said Ecuador, Bolivia is a plurinational state and Ecuador is a plurinational state. There is a lot of problem, but this is the constitution. And what does it mean? That the state can no longer be one nation. And that is the kind of, so it cannot be one literature. Cannot be even a continental literature or Latin American literature, because Latin America is not a subcontinent. Do you know that? Latin America is not a subcontinent. Latin America is a political project of the elite that gained an independence in complicity with France, because France was leading the south of Europe, overcoming Spain, and in complicity with the elite of Latin America, they invent the concept of Latin America. It's not colonial Latin America. Latin America is an invention of the second half of the 19th century. And France did that with the local elite because the United States was moving to the south. So the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, is kind of walking the French. They sent Maximiliano to Mexico. They kind of lobbied the elite of the Latin America and invented the question of Latin America and the idea of Latin America as a subcontinent. Latin America is a political process. So, but the idea of Latin America goes hand in hand with the idea of national. So the Latin America is kind of symbolic. It's not like the European Union. That's kind of in this integration now, but that's kind of Latin America is a symbolic name. So, and then the Global South. Yeah, the Global South, as you know, is a replacement of the Third World. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Second World collapsed, so we have the first and the third. We have to change something here. So the metaphor of the Global South emerged. And it has its function. That's kind of, but the question is that the Global South is in Europe. It's not just the South of Europe, it is the immigration. And the global South is in the United States. 45 millions of count, more or less, of Latinos, Latinas. Hey, this is like Chile, Bolivia, and Peru together, more or less. You know? So all of that is kind of, we are in this tremendous moment of re-articulation of the imaginary of the colonial matrix of power. Well, we can talk more about. But I mean, I wrote an op-ed essay recently called "The North of the South and the West of the East," because the Middle East is really the West of Asia, and that is how now they are naming themselves. We are the West of Asia. We belong to this kind of continent. So this is part of all the things that are happening in now. Okay. Okay, we start with the new question. How can you be? Well, I mean, decolonial is not a question of the poor and the marginal. One of our worst enemies is the media, the mass media. And in order to confront that, you don't confront them necessarily by, instead of teaching a Jew, going to work with a peasant way. So, decoloniality is not just supporting the poor. Decoloniality is confronting the colonial nature of power. And so, and the university is one of the places where the colonial nature of power is being reproduced. 90% of the faculty at Duke in the humanities and the social sciences were with Washington. We are in minority there. Sylvia Rivera Kusikanki raised that question in a very kind of aggressive way. Well, it so happened that 2 years ago, somebody translated that article to English and was published in South Atlantic Monthly at Duke, and I am in the editorial board. And she was very happy. Now she's saying that she didn't know that the article was translated. So, Jameson is a Duke, and I remember when I went to Duke, we said, how a Marxist can be a Duke and have a kind of house in the country house of the 19th century. Well, give me a break. I mean, I am sorry for leaving, right? So, the coloniality of Marxists works at every level of society. So that is my one of my justification. And I say one more thing. If I am not a Jew, and I am resisting retiring, because I know what is going to happen. They won't replace me. They may replace me with a lecture. Because the rest of the money of my salary will go to computer science, or will go to biology, or will go to some of these kind of corporate needs. The university, Duke University, don't need humanists. They hire humanists because it looks good. But the money is going someplace else. So there is a lot of things to do at every level. So dependency theory, I don't know what is the relationship with that. Or that's related to materiality. Well, yeah, there is a material world. But not every member of the group will say what they say, because we share modernity, coloniality, but then we have different articulation of that. That kind of make the group very diverse. It's not, I mean, modernity, coloniality is not the Bible, they have one interpretation. So I put a lot of emphasis in epistemology rather than ontology and materiality, because we don't see what we see, what there is, but we see what we see. So thinking is doing, but the kind of and I have a chapter in the dark side of the Renaissance that is called the materiality of reading and writing cultures. You remember that chapter? Yeah? So I deal with materiality there of reading and writing culture, but I do it from the point of view of epistemology, because it's an epistemology that creates ontology. If you think that ontology creates epistemology, you fall into the representation. And well, Richard Rorty, Foucault, and then Richard Rorty dismantled that. I mean, Richard Rorty in his book, Philosophy as the Mirror of Nature. Right? So I know that there is this kind of new materialism now, and there is a lot to say about that. But when I read new materialism, I see there, they don't talk about post anymore, because apparently the post-ban discourse, that was new. But newness is one of the key words of modernity, and it started with the new world, and the new Toyota, and the new iPod. So the new materialism is constantly recycling. Look at the bibliography they quote. It's constantly recycling. It's a kind of a machine of making sausage out of the knowledge, the kind of the regional knowledge of the West. So in this area, I follow Humberto Maturana. And I follow Humberto Maturana, and his work, I discovered his work in 1970. And so with him, I kind of privileged, and there is an argument here that has to do with cognition and biology of cognition, and has to do with the body, and we don't have body, because people say we have a body, we have a language. No, it's we add bodies. There is not something that is me that have a body. No, but there is, I am a body, and we don't have language. We add languages. We are bodies that converse, that in the term of Maturana, languaging. And it's in that languaging that the material world, the ontological world, makes sense. Otherwise, it's a kind of amorphous matter or amorphous ontology. It's a kind of this living organism that we call human that makes sense of that materiality and that ontology. Right? And materiality itself is an epistemological concept. Right? It's not matter that says I am matter, I am material. It's an option, it's an epistemological and political position to privilege matter and materiality. And I am not saying that this spirit or soul exists, because both are in Western fashion. Body, mind, body, soul, body, mind, etc., etc. So the new materialism, I see it, still is that's very interesting, but it's a North Atlantic issue. It's not for the rest. There are other concerns and other ones to go, and one of them is the colonialism.
Wow. Since we agreed with our friends, we will speak later during the night of universal and local in Western Marxism. I think that now we can thank Walter Mignolo for his generosity in discussing with us his work and answering the questions.
I just realized.